Hey guys, Tyson here. Welcome back to a brand new week. Hope you had a good weekend. If it was anything near mine, it would have been a good weekend for you. We went down to Brighton here. It was just about an hour by train out of London. A little seaside town with lots of the hipster little coffee shops, and it was also the National Naked Bike Ride Day. I'm not sure if that's what it's called. There was a lot of skin down in Brighton. I keep your eyes on my Instagram because we got a lot of photos. If you're into that kind of thing, otherwise probably never look at my Instagram because there's going to be too much skin on there for the next few weeks. But I didn't take part. I'm purely talking about the participants. We had nothing to do with it apart from the fact we were clapping quite loudly. Also made a really nice purchase of a disgusting 1987 hipster floral shirt, which I can't wait to flaunt. You're either going to love me for it or just be so disappointed. I've got a feeling most of you will be disappointed in the purchase that I've made, but I honestly rock it with so much confidence. You should at least appreciate the gesture. I'm not sure. It's pretty impressive. Jesse liked it. Anyway, guys, these introductions are ridiculous. Let me just tell you about today's guest. Today's guest is a guy by the name of Phil Parker. If you haven't heard of him before, he's an internationally renowned lecturer, therapist, and psychologist. This guy's story is incredible. I actually heard of him for the first time about, it must be 6 to 9 months ago when a friend of mine in Melbourne was struggling with chronic fatigue. She had been for the last couple of years, and her family was at a bit of a loss with how to conquer it, how she could actually get over this problem that she was having. And they tried seemingly everything until they came across Phil Parker's The Lightning Process. The Lightning Process and Phil Parker's work looks at how we can reprogram our brain, how we can train our brain to interpret the situations or just deal with the situations that we find ourselves a little differently. I think through a conversation with this guy, my mind was completely opened, brand new, just to the power that we have to make changes in the way that we see the world, make changes in the way that we label ourselves. I mean, I could do my best to try and explain everything that this guy's been doing in the last 30 years, but I'm not going to be able to do that in a 2-minute introduction. So I'm just going to move out of your way, let you listen to this conversation for about the next 45 minutes. We get into it as much as we can. We're on a bit of a time limit, but the amount that we got out of this conversation was exciting. And I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. I was really excited when I finished this one. And I just think it's so relevant. I think it's so exciting. A lot of us beat ourselves up. A lot of us put ourselves down, and we just call ourselves, that we've got low self-esteem or we're lacking confidence. But Phil Parker says, hey, there's a whole nother way you can deal with the challenges that you face, and he wants to walk us through a few of them. So if you've got anything in your life, which we all do, that you'd like to see improved, I think this is a great place to start. So let me get out of your way and introduce the great man, Phil Parker.
I'm the soul challenger, I'm the road damager. Now behold the cold and the straight magical. Cause the sky brings fires and the strong grow weary. The heroes built blood in the blast and the fury. Pray on the power and pray to your father. Cause all of the quakes in the universe resonate to your heartbeat and your faith.
Hey, to kick it off, I'm really interested, just a really basic question to start the conversation. I've been a fan of your work for a little while now, and as a fan of your work, I've seen how many different components and how many different elements your work sort of takes on, and how many sort of different situations it can be really helpful in. I'm just really curious, how do you go about when you're in a dinner party or when you're out and someone asks you what you do? How do you answer that question? I can imagine it would be a challenge.
It is. It's been a challenge. I mean, I've been doing this stuff for about 30 years. It's only in the last few years I've come up with a half decent answer to that question, because as you say, somebody says, what do you do? And I'm like, I used to say, it's a bit complicated. How long have you got? Because, I could explain it by, I work with people in peak performance. So I was the performance coach for the first person ever to walk the entire length of the Amazon. I work with people who are on high end sports who do like stuff like European Golf Tour. I coach people on that. I coach pop stars and movie stars, but also in my PhD work, I work with some people who've got kind of the least stuff going on for them positively, like street using drug addicts who are homeless. I also work with people who are so ill that they can't swallow without being fed through a tube. And I work in big corporates. I talk about language, and I talk about health, and people kind of glaze over and go, how can you do all those things? So they're coming up with something snappy that doesn't take about half an hour to even begin to explain why. The way I describe it at the moment is that I'm an expert in the psychology of health, happiness, and genius, and that kind of does encapsulate a lot of what I do. It still has lots of unanswered questions. It's like, what do you mean? But that is kind of what I'm fascinated by, and the reason it's such a complicated answer to what is quite a simple question is that when you work in the way I work, which is looking at what we can do with the extraordinary neurological physical systems in our body, how we can block ourselves, how can we be extraordinary, that working in that area, which is so fascinating, can really lead into any other area. You know, we can work in education, we can work in sports, we can work in music, we can work in creativity, we can work in health, and so on and so forth. So because we're dealing with the stuff of what it is to be a human, whether we're being a successful, brilliant human, or, you know, a human who's not very happy with our lives, that's the field that we play in. So therefore, it can be pretty much anything.
Yeah, I guess in the last couple of years, I've really noticed a little bit of a collision of the mind-body relationship. I think a lot of the time when we speak about health, we're referring, especially in the Western world, to I've been to the gym or I've been for a run, I'm eating a good diet. But I think, and mindfulness has obviously become a lot bigger conversation in the last couple of years. But what I love so much about your work and what's empowered me so much through what you do is seeing where those two things collide. And I'm continually surprised by how much of an impact our mind can have on the function of our body. And I think that a great example of this, and my introduction to you was actually through a friend of mine back in Melbourne who for the last 2 years has been really struggling with chronic fatigue. And her family was at a loss. They were really stressed that, as I said, they'd been looking at diet and health and sleep and a million different remedies. And I'm not sure how they came across your work, but they came across your lightning process. And a few weeks ago, I got a call from my good friend in Melbourne. I'd actually visited her back in Melbourne, and she was telling me that her sister Kate had now completely recovered for about, it must be 6 months. She's been free of any of the symptoms of chronic fatigue. And she started to talk to me a little more about the lightning process that you teach. And it still blows my mind, even though this is a scene of work that I'd say a little bit well acquainted with now. The fact that there is actually a procedure that someone can take in order to cure physical symptoms through mental steps is really interesting. I would love to hear you speak a little more about the lightning process and how something like that can have such an amazing impact on someone's physical health.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's we kind of have to go back a little bit in time to basic philosophy, where there's a guy called René Descartes, who was really interested in trying to understand what was real and what wasn't real. And he started to promote this idea, what's called the Cartesian duality, which is there is a mind and there is a body, and those two are separate. And because he could feel and experience the body, but he couldn't feel and experience the mind, because the mind is a process. It's not something you can touch and hold. So he thought, well, these two things are clearly different. And so medicine, certainly in the Western world, not so much everywhere else, but in the Western world, took a particular turn where it decided that mental and physical were completely separate. It's taken a long time for them to start to look at these two things as being connected. And even working out where the mind is an interesting question. We kind of assume it's fundamentally sits in the brain. The Greeks didn't think that; they thought it sat in the stomach, because people experience mental health issues in terms of physical changes in their digestion. But if we assume that the mind is mainly sat in the brain is the kind of big interface between those two systems. What we think about the world, about ourselves, and how we process that and how it affects our body. And what the lightning process is very, very interesting in is the brain-body connection. How does the brain control physiological functions within the body and get things back to normal? So that if we cut ourselves, then naturally, we'll heal. If it's not too bad a cut, we get a paper cut, it will get better. And the body just gets on with it. What we're interested in is particularly when that hasn't happened, when people have got stuck, where they should heal. So chronic fatigue is a really interesting example. And I'll talk about it a little bit because it's also very controversial as an illness, and the lightning process as a treatment for it is something that people have lots of questions about. So again, a bit of history. Originally, when people had chronic fatigue, and there were a number of different names for it, people thought because they couldn't find anything physically wrong with these people. They thought, oh, it's probably just a mental illness. It's probably in their mind. They're just malingering. They should really just get up and get well. And for a long, long time, people with chronic fatigue had a real tough time convincing people they were properly ill, because there was nothing to find. It's not like you take a blood test and you can find a bug. There isn't anything so far that we've identified with chronic fatigue that tells us what is causing it. And so for a long time, they really fought against, we are properly ill. And they got a lot of stick for it. Got a lot of not very supportive, medical professionals kind of going, come on, just get on with it. It turned out that there is a physiological thing going on. There are changes that you can detect in people with chronic fatigue that people who don't have chronic fatigue do not have. So the World Health Organization recognizes it as a neurological illness, probably with some kind of autoimmune stuff going on. But we're still a long way from completely understanding the illness. And this is one of the issues for the lightning process. The lightning process comes along and says, listen, we recognize that this illness, chronic fatigue, like multiple sclerosis, which is another illness that we work with, is a physical illness. But we think the best way to make changes to your physiology is to access your brain. If we can find a way to get inside the system and tweak and reset things and get everything back to how it should be, then hopefully what we'll be able to do is help you to kick off a recovery response where everything starts to heal and get back to normal. It's similar a little bit to chemo. If you have, so you have cancer and you have chemo, what chemo does is it kills all the fast-growing cells. The chemo itself doesn't fix the cancer. What then has to happen is your body then will hopefully reboot with good, healthy cells. So that basically the chemo generally kind of eradicates all cells and then hopes that your body will kick off in a better direction. Lightning process is similar. It's not exactly the same as chemo, but what it does is it says, if we can somehow find a way to reset, to reboot your nervous system's control over your physiology, then hopefully we can, stimulate a healing response. And the easiest way to get inside someone's brain to help them to change the way their brain works is to teach them ways of consciously controlling the pathways in their brain. And so at that point, that's where the intervention is. The lightning process is looking at how do we help you to use your brain differently. So you're going to be involved in that process, consciously controlling and pointing your brain in the right direction. The problem is some people misunderstand that and think, oh, so the lightning process is all about mental change and therefore the illnesses are mental. It's a simplification of what we're saying, which is if we can help people to change the way their brains work, the brain controls huge amounts of the physiology. By changing the physiology, by working with the brain, you can get amazing change, extraordinary change in the body, like your friend discovered in Melbourne.
Yeah, it's incredible. And I think one of the most amazing parts about this is I often hear people speak about how they're quite anxious or they're stressed or they're impatient or they can't sleep or insert whatever it is that people are dealing with at the moment. And I think you've been dealing with the symptoms for so long that over the time it becomes a label for our life. We just start to assume that that's the person I am. That's just the way that life is going to be. And what you're saying is through this retraining of the brain and the way that you direct your thoughts is that you can almost create a new path in the way that your brain is functioning to send new messages to your body. Because I always find it really interesting how two people can respond differently to the same situation. And my wife and I are a great example of this. We'll both be confronted with the same situation and, I might be impatient and frustrated and she might see it as an opportunity for us to grow or get something. She's continually teaching me these things. But what fascinates me about that is, I guess, purely the way that our minds are functioning with that situation. So if you had someone in front of you that was dealing with anxiety or depression or frustration, and I can imagine these symptoms, and I guess the advice that you would give these people would vary greatly depending on the situation. But what is a simple sort of practical step that someone dealing with anxiety or, depression or I guess insert whatever you will there could do to start making some changes?
Well, if I look at anxiety as a great example, and again, we hear this kind of different conversation. There's physical illness and mental illness, and if you have physical illness, people have a very different relationship to it than if you have mental health issues. People see that as being much more permanent and difficult to fix. It's not. First thing I'd say to somebody with anxiety is listen to what you're saying in your head. And particularly what I'd listen to is the speed at which you're saying it. if you were to able to listen to somebody with anxiety and kind of stick a microphone inside their brain and listen to what they were saying, you'd hear a lot of noise, and it would be fast noise. So the conversations would normally be, why is this happening? Oh my God, I feel so stressed. Very, very rapid. And there's an interesting thing physiologically, which is when we speak, as I'm speaking to you, with our breath, mainly on our out breath. If we speak fast, then naturally our breathing has to start to catch up with our speech. So when we fast speak, we increase our breathing rate. If we increase our breathing rate too high, we start to do something called hyperventilation. Hyperventilation means just breathing fast, but it has a physiological effect on our body. It actually changes our blood chemistry by changing the amount of carbon dioxide and oxygen balance in the blood, and that changes how we physically feel. It also kicks off a whole bunch of neurological kind of stuff going on in your brain, in your nervous system, in your hormonal system. So if people are speaking fast, either in conversation or even more importantly, inside their head, it will tend to trigger this stress response, this switching on of this hyperventilation style. Even if they're not speaking out loud, their brain and their breathing are so, their speech and their breathing are so connected. So a simple remedy, therefore, is if you just start to slow down, start to slow your voice, both talking to others and talking to yourself. As you can notice, as I'm speaking now, you can hear that difference in the speed of the voice. Naturally, then my breathing will slow down. Even if it's just the voices in my head, the thoughts I'm having, it will also slow my breathing down. It will start to just shift that sense of, am I in threat or is it okay to relax? And we switch from one part of our nervous system to another part called the parasympathetic, which is all about chilling out and calming. And just doing that is a really simple way to do it. And one of the things I say to people is, imagine if you saw a little dog and it was trapped, and you walked towards it and it was frightened. How would you talk to it? Well, clearly you'd talk in a calm, even though dogs can't really understand the words we say, they understand the sound. So we wouldn't go, it's okay, it's going to be fine, because the dog would freak out. Do this to ourselves all the time. People go, so not only is the speed of their voice wrong, but also the words they use are often problematic, in that if you say words, they have an effect on the way your brain functions. There's some great studies where if you say the word pain or any word related to pain, you'll see a firing up of the parts of the brain that process those kind of pain signals. So every single time you say, oh God, I'm so stressed, you actually increase your stress. Every time you say, interestingly, I must not be stressed,
yes,
you increase stress. So there's lots of stuff, really simple stuff that people can do. And these are some of the things we cover in the lightning process, but just general things about easy ways to start to shift which direction you're pointing your neurology in.
Yeah, I can imagine that'd be so helpful because, I think at some stage in our life we all deal with anxiety for maybe an extended period of time. And I've heard you speaking on quite a few of your videos, and I don't want to destroy your words here, so feel free to correct me if I don't do a good job. But I heard you saying that, from years and years ago, we obviously had a reason to be fearful or a reason to be anxious. We might have been sleeping out in nature and we wake up and naturally we want to be alert because there could be some dangers around. But over time, things have become safer, but the anxiety levels that a lot of us deal with now, they seem to linger. They seem to not dissipate as quickly as they once would have. Why do you think it is that a lot of people now, when we're dealing with anxiety, obviously because we're not really doing anything to change the way we're thinking about it, we may not even know about it. I think this is one thing I love about your work, is it's so powerful, but I still feel like in a conversation with so many people, a lot of people haven't heard about the power of what it is that you do. To be honest, I've followed you for a long time and still didn't really even know about the power of the lightning process until I had a personal friend of mine tell me how much it's changed. But why do you think it is that anxiety is such a problematic thing in 2017?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there's a couple of things here. There's some research that says, like you were saying, when we're out in nature, one of the things we need to be aware of is danger. It's important to survive, so we have to have an awareness for threat. So we need to keep our eyes open for, like meerkats, on the prairie around. And there is some research that says that negative experiences hit us harder than positive experiences, to about, they reckon, a ratio of 4-1. And certainly most of us will have that experience. Let's say someone says to you, hey, you did a great job. You're like, oh, thanks. But if somebody turns to you and goes, you did a shit job there, you're like, oh, God. It's like, it doesn't say thing. Even though the message is, just one side of the opinion and one's the other side of the opinion, the effect on it is much stronger. And there's a nice little thought about it, or metaphor, which is consider positive things to be a bit like Teflon, non-stick coating, they kind of bounce off, and negative comments to be a bit like Velcro. Yes. So we need to be aware of that. We also know that hormones, stress hormones, cortisol and adrenaline are higher in the morning, and that's about getting us up and getting us ready to kind of approach the day. So there are all those things going in the background. And the other thing that happens is we have this physiological response where if a threat appears, let's say a wild animal, we kick into a very particular system. And a great example of this is when you're a kid at school, when you lean back on a chair and you're kind of taking it easy, and then you lean back a little bit too far and you just feel yourself about to fall. That kind of, you feel your whole nervous system kind of going, ah!
Yes.
That's the stress response, the physical emergency response. It's a physical response. It's not just a stress in terms of, oh, I'm a bit anxious. It's a physical response to threat and danger. And you can get it if you get sunburnt, you get the same response, or if you drink too much, you get the same response. And it causes a huge amount of changes in your physiology. But what's interesting is most of the threats that we're under when we're out in the wild, like the classic example is you get approached by a tiger, then it's going to get resolved in 10 or 15 seconds. You're either going to be eaten by the tiger or you're going to run away. And so this whole stress response, this threat response, what we call a physical emergency response, is designed to be triggered momentarily and then resolved, because it's such a powerful response. It allows us to run super fast. We can you hear stories of women who find their babies trapped under a car. They can lift a car up. It's amazing what we can do. But of course, we have to channel energy from other systems into the limb muscles particularly, and certain systems get switched off. So classically, the immune system gets switched off, the digestive system gets switched off, and the clever thinking system gets switched off. And you can recognize those are really important systems. We don't want to switch them off too much. That will have a serious impact. But that's okay, because we only get stressed or experience threat for about 15 seconds. Adrenaline gets produced into our body, and then every 15 seconds, half of it gets removed. We have a natural way of getting rid of it. So it's fine. Problem we have is we're not faced by tigers. It's not the stuff we're dealing with. We're dealing with, 3 or 4 year degrees, 25-year mortgages, 10-year marriages, or even shitty phone calls where, you have to not say what you really want to say to someone because you work in customer services. You have to kind of be calm and trying to manage this difficult situation. So I think that's part of the problem, is we've got this system that wasn't really designed for the kind of stresses that we deal with, we deal with unnatural stresses. And I think you come back to 2017, I love technology. I'm surrounded by it here. But it also provides an opportunity for us to get stressed in all sorts of ways. Just looking at the Twitter feed and we suddenly see something that annoys us, or some disaster happening in the world. Or we're at home and we get a call, or we check our emails or Facebook and we see a business conversation that we now have to engage with. And so we're off a lot less of the time. We're much more on than we used to be. And I think that's a problem as well.
I can imagine. And one of the things I'd been reading a little more about this week was the actual, I'm not sure if it's physical changes that take place in our brain, but you were saying we so often get to a point where we're about to make a decision or react to a situation, and we almost come to a fork in the road where we can decide to be impatient, like a lot of us do, or anxious or stressed or whatever it is. And that is the road that we usually take when we come to when we're confronted with whatever it is we're confronted with. Or we can take the right-hand turn, which is maybe the path that's covered by a few weeds and a few rocks, and we haven't really taken that path, and it can be a little difficult to venture down. But would you be able to explain the actual what I'm trying to explain, I guess, in more scientific terms? Because I'm sure your version of it's a lot more sort of engaging than what I'll try and do.
That was a great description. So again, history is kind of intriguing in this. Whenever we try try and understand things, we usually reference it to what's going on in the world. So when they first started looking at the body, at that time they were really interested in steam engines, and so they thought the heart was like a pump, and they just imagined that the whole of the body would be pumped around like a kind of water system, and they thought the brain was the same. And then as they moved forwards into kind of radios and TVs and circuit boards, where the kind of the wire is burnt into the insulating material, and I thought, the brain's a little bit more like a circuit board. And the problem with circuit boards is once a circuit is laid down, it's laid down now forever. And so we've got this idea that the brain is fixed. So you hear things like, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. This is just the way it is. Well, what's interesting now is that the most interesting and new kind of technology on the planet is the internet. This whole communication system. With the internet, we get this interesting phenomenon where, let's say, Kim Kardashian, gets her bum out, then all of a sudden that goes to the top of the internet. Yeah. It comes up the top of the Google rankings because so many people look at it. They tell their friends, "Oh, look at this," and it raises instantly. And this is a good example of a network responding to usage. So things that are looked at a lot on the internet turn up high in the search rankings or the news feeds of people. And the brain is the same, it turns out. So that if we use a particular pathway, in a pathway you get this thing called a synapse, which is basically a little gap between one nerve, one cable, if you will, and the next cable. And the reason for this is, there's a power station somewhere over there where I'm living, and it's producing power all the time, but I don't want my lights on all the time, so I have a switch so I can switch the lights on and off. Even though the power's always in the system, I can choose whether I use it. And the brain's the same, has these little gaps to decide, do I want this signal to continue onwards, or do I want to stop it at this point? So this is why you put your trousers on in the morning, you'll feel them, or your socks or your shoes, then after a while your brain goes, I'm not interested in that anymore, and just dials it down. It says, we're not going to let that signal come up to our consciousness. And so most of the time we're unaware of lots of our experience. It turns out that these little junctions, these synapses, these switches, they have this ability to be extra sensitive or have low sensitivity. And they also have an ability to decide, because at a junction you may have two directions it could go at that point. Once it jumps that little gap, it could trigger one nerve pathway that goes to happiness and another one that goes to sadness. So you think about your old friend you haven't seen for a long time. You could go, oh God, you had some great times, or you could go, oh, I'm a bit sad I haven't seen him for a long time. Either of those ones are possible. If we keep on triggering one of those options, let's say, I'm really sad I haven't seen them, then that pathway will start to become stronger. And what happens, and there's a video I've done on YouTube of this, is you actually get a movement of the nerves. So the nerve that's most used starts to move to the first nerve, and so the gap gets smaller between those two nerves, and the other one that's less used starts to actually move away physically. So you get a change in the shape and structure and architecture of these little switches. And as a result, the two nerves that are now closer, it's much easier for the little spark to jump the gap and trigger that pathway. And this is called neuroplasticity. So neuroplasticity is the more you use a pathway, the stronger it becomes. And this is very important because that means that if we keep on thinking about being stressed, then we'll get more stress. It'll be easier for us to get stressed. The really cool thing about neuroplasticity is neuroplasticity does not care. It's not interested in which pathway you're using. It just says which one are you using the most. So if you decide, like you were saying in your analogy, to take a left turn rather than a right turn, to go down a pathway you don't normally go down, so a pathway to calmness, happiness, contentedness, being present, being healthy, even though that's maybe a pathway that you're not familiar with, just by going down that pathway again and again and again, it will become the dominant pathway, because the brain will reorientate itself. It will kind of go, oh, if that's the pathway you're now using, then we'll start to use that. So neuroplasticity is a really, really interesting thing. And it tells us that we have lots and lots of influence on how we use our brain.
It's literally, it still blows my mind just to hear that there's such a practical explanation for the. It's just, it's still it's amazing to me that this science is coming out now. And I love your example of the Kim Kardashian thing, because I think so often the things that we're just used to are the things that stand out most. It's easiest for us to see. But I speak in a lot of schools over here and also back in Australia. And I speak a little bit about what we're speaking about now. But one of the most common responses to this when I speak about it is, yeah, but it's so hard to make that change. And I think one of the examples I love to give back is just the example of going to a gym. Obviously, you go to a gym once and you finish and your muscles are sore and you come home and, maybe you're not as inspired to try it again tomorrow. But if you gradually build up your tolerance to the weights and build up your ability to keep going back, it becomes more of a habit, it becomes easier, you're not as sore. And I try and encourage kids to sort of see this as a challenge for their brain to become stronger, like a gym membership. But like, what response would you give to a person in that situation? Because I understand the difficulty they're referring to when you're trying to make a change like this.
Well, I think kids are a great example of this, particularly if you have ones who play computer games. They can spend hours and days just sitting there going through the same, let's say they're going through a kind of maze type thing, and they know if they turn left, they fall into a hole or get bitten by a boss with big guns. So they now, how do we, and then they die, and then the game resets, and they go again, right, well, I tried this time. And what you can see there is exactly that process of them coming against an obstacle and kind of going, that didn't work, reset, okay, let's try this. Does this work? And what if I flip on my back and jump up in the ceiling and grab that chandelier? That works. So actually kids are very used to this, and in that context they're also not fearful of failure at all. For them, all that's going to happen is they're going to, the game is going to finish and it's going to start again. So having that as a kind of context is quite interesting for kids. How many times a day do the people that play those kind of games, do they fail? Hundreds of times, but they kind of go, there's got to be a way through this. I know, they wouldn't design a game that didn't have a path through. So I just need to keep on going until I find it. And what they're doing there is in neuroplastic learning. Start going, that didn't work. And the speed at which they can operate controls and remember where the right turning is extraordinary. And it's interesting. There's some interesting studies of kids with, attention deficit disorder, how much time they can actually focus on things like that, because those things really intrigue them. The more intrigued they are, the more able they are to focus on things.
That makes sense. So you mentioned also that it's not only anxiety, depression, and these kind of things that you're dealing with. You're also dealing with sports people and movie stars. And what I'm really interested about is just to get a little insight. When a sports person or a movie star or someone who's just trying to become even better at what they're already great at, how do you start with something like that? Where do you even look to make an improvement in a person that's coming to you just to flourish in their field?
Well, it's usually quite easy, because most people at that level recognize where their kind of blind spots are. They'll kind of go, it's always these kind of in golf, it's always these kind of holes, or if my first shot is bad, that's when it all goes wrong. Or this is where it happens. This is the issue. Because they're finely tuned and know what they know, they also often can identify for you where the problem is. The problem is not usually identifying the problem. The problem is how to resolve it. They're like, I've used all the strategies I already have, and I'm still stuck with this. So what do I do? And that's where we come in really and kind of go, okay, well, fundamentally working with people like that, I always start with, look, I will never know as much as you do about your game or about your skill set, because you're just better than I will ever be at that. But what I do know is about how brains work and how change occurs, and that's what we need to utilize here. So we work with them to identify, how do we make this change easy? And yeah, it's usually pretty easy.
Yeah. How did you actually get involved in the field? I guess it's becoming slowly more common or more known about, yet still, like I said earlier, it's probably not as known about as you would like it to be. Though you've worked with some amazing clients, it's a message that's changing people's lives when they actually hear it. So I can imagine you want everyone to hear it. But what was your own introduction to it? Because I heard you've been doing this now for 25, probably more years now. I can't imagine it would have been a real hot topic 25 years ago.
Well, I started my osteopathy course in 1984, so what is that? Something years ago. Obviously, I was 5 at the time, and then when I was doing the first year of osteopathy, I was always kind of interested in, what's possible, and I was a bit contrary. So if somebody said you can't do something. I was like, oh, I wonder if that's really true. I wonder what is possible. And then at the end of my first year, I think I was about 21. I was pushing a caravan with some friends, and my hand went through the caravan window because it didn't have that kind of good glass it has now. And they were kept on pushing it and shoving it from side to side. And I really severed my left wrist. I knew what I'd done because I just studied this in my first year of osteopathy. Went to the hospital, managed to not die, luckily. But they said, you'll never move your hand again. And that was a bit of a problem for me because I was an osteopath, but I was also a guitar player. I was a professional musician. So I said, okay, right, I want a second opinion. Second person said, you will never, ever move your fingers again. So I said, well, I have a third opinion. And I kept on asking, and everybody said exactly the same thing. They said, you severed this nerve, it's the ulnar nerve, doesn't recover. You'll probably be left with a claw, but don't expect to ever play the guitar or, use it much. And I said, well, great, but I'm not happy with that. I really need this. So I kept on asking. Eventually I found someone, a physiotherapist, who said, yeah, I think you'll be okay. And I decided to agree with her and ignore all the other opinions. But the other opinions are correct. That is what the general health belief was. I decided not to believe them. And I did recover. I completely recovered the use of my hand. And nobody else can see it, but you can see it. And it made me think, okay, well, what made a difference there? How significant was my desire, commitment, the importance of getting well? How significant was my belief I could get well? How significant would it have been if I'd listened to the consultants and experts who said, you will never recover? And what is the cost or benefit of those kind of conversations? How much do they affect everyone? Because I saw other people with the same injury and they didn't recover. But for most of them, it didn't really matter too much. They didn't really need it. You can get away with one hand doing most things. That kind of started me thinking a lot more about how our brain, how our thoughts, how our beliefs, what people say set up all sorts of interesting stuff in our neurology that may limit us or can support us. If somebody says something really empowering, then maybe that makes a difference too. So that's kind of where it began. And then I worked a lot with people, and some of the people that I worked with got great results and some didn't. And I thought, well, why are those people who I'm working with the same issues as this other group of people, why are they not getting the results that I would hope for? What do we do with them? Because often people would come to see me. I had a reputation for working with people who didn't get positive responses from other people. So they kind of came to see me as the last resort. I was like, well, where do I send them if they've come to see me as the last resort? And that's where the lightning process kind of began. It was like, okay, what do we do with these people? What have we missed? What's going on? How do we help them to, they've had great treatment from a bunch of people and they're not recovering. And this is originally people with anxiety and depression. And we got some great results. And then people started to come with other conditions, including chronic fatigue, multiple sclerosis, chronic pain, saying, can you help us? And we kind of went, okay, well, let's see. And we got, again, really surprisingly good results. So although I'm a very positive person, at the same time, I like to be rational about this. So when people are getting good results, I was like, okay, well, let's just see how it goes. Let's check it out, Don't rush this, let's see. And amazingly, to my surprise, they made extraordinary changes that, they sustained. And I thought, maybe we're onto something here. It seems to be making really good changes for things that don't normally change. And that was 18 years ago this year. I started the lightning process. Since then, over 20,000 people have done it in, I think, 4 different continents.
Wow.
In countries, in 5 different languages. And not everybody gets the same extraordinary results because we're teaching people a skill set. How do you use your brain to influence your body? But so many people do. It's gobsmacking and jaw dropping.
Yeah.
The changes can make using these these tools and using the onboard ability of us to change the way our body works.
I can imagine, like anything that's proving to be really positive and making a big impact in people's lives, you'd have your fair share of skeptics and criticism and sort of just naysayers without really looking into what it is that you do. Have you had a lot of those, and how do you handle the negative feedback that you get for your work?
We have had a certain amount of it. And when you look at their arguments, unfortunately, most of the arguments are quite spurious in that they will pretend to be very unscientific by saying things like, well, where's your evidence base? And, you know, if you work in a non-academic, non-orthodox medicine, getting an evidence base is quite tough. You have to have a lot of money and a lot of time or supporters in those areas. And we're actually starting to build an evidence base. But I'll often say stuff like, where's your evidence base? It's all nonsense, isn't it? And then you'll say, well, we've got an evidence base. And then they'll say things like, I knew somebody's dentist's sons and they said that it was dreadful, so it's dreadful. It's like, well, you can't have it both ways. You can't claim that there's no evidence base and therefore it's no good, and then base your opinions about how rubbish it is on somebody's anecdotal response. So usually what you've got is people who don't understand what we're talking about. Like I said right at the beginning, this distinguishing mental approaches and what we're looking at, which is changing physiology using the brain. And people often get lost in that conversation. As soon as they hear we're using the brain and we're not using drugs, they go, it's all nonsense, it's all rubbish. And how do I deal with it? I used to get into debates with them about it to explain, actually, like we talked about, no, there's a bit of a misunderstanding here. But what I've generally found is those people are not actually interested in open discussions. They're just interested in holding their own opinions, and they don't want to budge from them. So I don't tend to spend much of my energy talking to them. I'm happy to have a conversation with them, but as soon as it starts to get into where it normally goes, which is some kind of, a chance to attack, I think, well, okay, I've got better things to do. I think Mark Twain said, trying to have a discussion with someone who is not reasonable is like trying to, resuscitate a dead man. It's just not doable until they're ready to have an open, sensible, engaged scientific debate. Scientific meaning we don't know yet. We need to explore it in a rational way. And I'm happy to do that. But anything else, there's just not much value for anybody in doing that.
Yeah. Look, we've only got a few minutes left. So before we wrap it up, I thought I just wanted to ask you a couple of quick last minute questions.
Sure.
A lot of people around the world obviously look up to you and admire your work and are really inspired by what you do. And I certainly put myself in that category. But who do you look to for inspiration, or who is it that you go to? No, maybe inspiration is the wrong word, but who are people you continually find yourself reading or watching or listening to?
I would say the people I'm most inspired by are clients, patients, because that's where I learn most of what I learn from. They do stuff and you think, oh my God, that's amazing. So people will tell me, I remember I was working with somebody, a group of people who had done the lightning process for, I think, chronic fatigue. And they came in on the third day and they said, I hope it's okay, I just wanted to check this out with you, but I've been having these menopausal hot flushes and I use the process and I managed to get rid of them. Is that okay? I was like, of course it's okay. Do that, so they're kind of teaching me the extraordinariness of how the body works. That's what I find most fascinating.
And for anyone else out there who's really loving what we're speaking about right now and interested in, maybe learning a little bit more about what you teach or just trying to apply these lessons to your life, I see you've got a lot of books out there. You also run a lot of courses. Where can people find out a little more about you or get in touch with you?
Best place is philparker.org or lightningprocess.com. And of course, I'm on Facebook. Just look for me, philparker.author. And I'm always happy to chat to people if I can, because like you said earlier, I think this stuff is so important. This is the stuff we never learned in school. We learned about geography and trigonometry, stuff we barely use in our life. We didn't learn about how to manage relationships, how to be happy, how to change our health, all these kind of things. So I think it's just the most fascinating thing. And I'm really happy to share this stuff with people.
Beautiful. I'll make sure I include that in the show notes. An absolute last question, Phil, before I let you go. If there was one bit of advice that you think more people need to hear, more people need to apply to their life, is there one particular thing you find yourself saying more than anything else?
Yeah, be nice to yourself. We have a phrase in the learning process, which is, if you treated your friends like you treat yourself, would you have any? And the answer is often no. But people are absolute bastards to themselves.
Yes.
They really give themselves a hard time. They're mean-hearted, unpleasant, super critical, do themselves down if they choose something. They're going to go, yeah, it wasn't that good, or And so I would say no. But, develop self-compassion. People often find it easier to be nicer to other people than they are to themselves, but actually be nice to yourself. It's one of the most significant things you could do. A couple of things: if you're happy and you're nice to yourself, you get an extra 10 years of life. That's the same amount of time as smoking would cost you if you smoked. And they did a study recently on Twitter where they studied language. And people who use lots of really negative, angry, frustrated, hateful language, you could predict they're more likely to have heart disease. You predict that better than if you knew if they were obese or smoked. So how we manage ourselves, how we think about ourselves, really, really important.
Yeah, beautiful. Well, Phil, hey, firstly, thanks so much for making the time to stop by and have a chat. Really appreciate it. Thanks also for the amazing work you continue to put out there and the help you're offering people all around the world. I'm super grateful to have the chance to chat with you.
Brilliant. Lovely to speak to you too.
Beautiful. Thanks so much, Phil.